Welcome to The Audience Connection. This is the podcast where we focus on how businesses can create content that builds more genuine connections with their audience.
Each episode, we dive into the art and science of storytelling, speaking with the sharpest minds in brand, marketing, and creative storytelling.
Our guests share their strategies, insights, and creative choices that made their audiences care.
Brought to you by Casual, the video partner for global brands. With offices in the US, EMEA, and APAC,
Casual leverages the art and science behind creating impactful stories to drive business results for their clients.
we're your hosts. I'm Lydia Chan.
And I'm Ollie Atkinson. This is The Audience Connection.
Welcome back to the show, everyone. You are listening to The Audience Connection. Today, we're teeing up Ollie's chat with Richard Shotton. Some of you may have heard of him. Richard is a best-selling author of The Choice Factory and The Illusion of Choice. He's also the founder of Astro 10 and one of the clearest voices on applying behavioral science to real-world marketing.
Yeah, so Richard is really a leader in this field, really, and his latest book has just come out. I've got it here with me. It's still on my desk. It's called Hacking the Human Mind, and it's a little bit different to his last couple of books. So each chapter starts with a brand case study and then unpacks the behavioral science and why it worked. These are real stories. They're from Red Bull, Apple, Klarna, Dyson, brands you really know and love, and the studies underneath are incredible. You get these real rich stories, these academic stories of these psychological studies, but then you also get how to apply those principles in your own work.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, it just makes the principles more digestible, and I guess, from Richard's kind of perspective, it's the storytelling of how to do that, right? And he does that in such a really great way in his books. So what else can listeners expect from the conversation?
Yeah, I think one of the things that really stuck out was this idea of making it easy. It's key really to lower the cognitive load, so the message goes in one idea per piece. Use concrete language, and the case study we talk about is Apple's 1,000 songs in your pocket for iPod, rather than having a spec sheet of the RAM and the number. It just doesn't really work. But when you put it into somebody's pocket, they can really imagine it in their mind. So using that concreteness is a really, really interesting point in the pod, I thought.
For sure. And if you're a product marketer, right, listening right now, we definitely see marketers fall into this trap of listing features using jargon, right? So let's avoid doing that, right? And we definitely avoid doing that with the work that we do at Casual, making sure the message is clear, using plain English. And again, how do you connect with your audience in a way that's relatable to them?
Yeah. And then we talked a little bit about how you can really stand out in your category, and there's some lovely stories from Liquid Death, and how to make your brand distinct. And a really nice bit from Red Bull around how making a slimmer can of an energy drink helped that brand to command a huge premium really on their sales. So we visit lots of different topics. Richard's incredible. He can just pull the studies out from thin air and just tell you all about them. So there's so much information to absorb. We also revisit some of the ideas from our episode with Orlando around fluent devices and compound creativity, and Richard brings a whole fresh angle to both of those as well. So yeah, it's a really good one.
Awesome. Well, let's get into it. Here's Ollie and Richard Shotton.
Hello and welcome back to The Audience Connection. Today's guest is Richard Shotton, a leading voice in behavioral science for marketing and comms. So if you've ever argued over evidence or over opinion, you've probably quoted Richard. His first two books, The Choice Factory and The Illusion of Choice, became behavior science Bibles. And then his new one, out recently, Hacking the Human Mind, turns brand stories backed by behavioral science studies into practical experiments you can try out. I'm really excited to have him here and dig into some of these studies. So Richard, welcome to the show.
Very good to be here. Thank you very much for having me.
No worries. And so the book's been out for about a month now. So it launched in September.
Pretty much exactly.
Pretty to the day almost. Yeah. And I've been reading it this month, and quite a good month to actually read it, because there's a nice chapter in there on Starbucks and the spiced pumpkin latte, which I had while I was reading that section, which was great. There's loads in there to take away, and we're going to dive into some of those chapters today. And there was another bit that really stuck out for me, which was, it's in the Kraft cheese, mac and cheese chapter, where you're talking about, now I'm going to pronounce this wrong, but pareidolia? Is it the way you see faces?
The tendency to see patterns and give random objects meaning that isn't there. Especially, we're prone to see faces in clouds or trees, which is a little, very small bias that the Kraft mac and cheese use in their packaging.
Yeah, and that for me as a filmmaker as well, and like we often talk about faces and the importance of seeing people and not keeping it too abstract, and that connection that really resonated with me. But then also near where I live, there's an estate agent, and there's this like eyes, lights, and then a huge bushy eyebrows of like the lanterns over the top and a gigantic mouth. And every time I see it now, I'm like, that's pareidolia.
Yeah. It's a nice variety of brands you pick there, because Starbucks and pumpkin spice latte in particular was the focus of a chapter. And it's very much around scarcity and avoiding habituation. It's at the very heart of what pumpkin spice latte is. So it's a big macro use of some of these behavioral science principles. And then the other end, really tactical, tiny little tweak to the packaging, is Kraft mac and cheese, where they have a macaroni piece of pasta that's shaped on the packaging like a smile. And it's a really good way of getting people's attention in the crowded environment that is the supermarket aisle. So those two examples, I think, show quite nicely the sheer breadth of use of behavioral science. It can be fundamental to what the product is and the strategy of that product, its fundamental designs, all the way through to the most tactical of tweaks.
Yeah. And Casual, we're starting to apply more of this, and I'm starting to see that as well. It's like there is, from the very idea of your creative, there can be a kind of behavioral science application there, or down to like, just the labor illusion and how much you're putting into, the proposal that's going over. We can come into all of that later on, but the book is slightly different from your last two. So I was just wondering, what I thought was really strong is like, you've gone to the brand story, and then into the application of the science, where that comes from, and then how you can then apply that yourself in your own work. Why was it a departure from your last two books?
So I did two things differently. Firstly, it was co-authored. So I wrote it with an American entrepreneur called Michael Aaron Flicker. So that's the first difference. But then the second bit is, as you say, I flipped the kind of model of the choice factory and the illusion of choice on its head. So with those two books, each chapter is about a behavioral science bias, a behavioral science principle, and it follows the same pattern. Here's the academic evidence. Here's the evidence or research I've run to show those biases work today. And then I talk about practical ways that marketers can use it. With Hacking the Human Mind, every chapter revolves around a brand. So one chapter's on Kraft mac and cheese, one's on Haagen-Dazs, one's on Facebook, one's on Amazon Prime, so on and so forth. We start with a little potted history of the brand, and then identify two, probably three behavioral science principles that brand has used that has helped power their success. And that was the approach for a couple of reasons. Firstly, the more I talk to people about behavioral science, do presentations, training, whatnot, the more I see that if you just stay in the realm of the experiments, it's often too abstract for people to see how to use the ideas. But if you ground everything in a very practical example of what a brand has done, suddenly it makes it far more easy to understand. And I think it's an absolute travesty if this amazing body of work that is behavioral science, if it just stays as something we discuss that academics experiment on, but it never gets used, it's an absolute waste. So that was kind of one reason. And then the second reason why it's brand focused was it's a bit of a twist on maybe a more standard approach. There's if you go to any creative agency or media agency or market department, when people are looking for inspiration, what they often do is think, well, which brands have done amazing things? Who's booming in our category or an adjacent category? And then they think, well, let's copy some of the things they've done. And it sounds like a really sensible approach. But if you think about it for a second, there's a bit of a flaw, which is for a brand like Amazon Prime or Starbucks, they are complex entities. They are doing hundreds of things concurrently. So you don't really know, if you just randomly copy some of their behaviors, whether the thing you're copying is crucial to that brand's success or it was just incidental. Or it might have even been a negative drag on their effectiveness. So what we've done with this book is, yes, identify 70 very successful brands. We then look at all the types of tactics they undertook, and then we apply a behavioral science lens. So we say, of the things that Pumpkin Spice Latte did, or Liquid Death, what are the ones that have also been proved to work in peer-reviewed, controlled experimental conditions? And that way, I think you're moving from a random piece of copying, which might just be copying noise and incidental detail. This way, you can copy practical techniques that are proven to work in multiple different scenarios. So I think you've got a better chance of success by this type of copying than something done a bit more blindly.
And it helps with that, selling that idea in as well. If you've got a practical case study there, and that narrative story is so important when you're trying to convince someone of something as well. So
yeah, absolutely,
to be able to
absolutely.
attach the two together.
You could argue too important in some respects. I actually think there could be a great book written about 17 brands that have kind of been a bit crap, but they've got interesting things that are just overwhelmed with other ideas. I think there could be a really good book there. I'm not sure if there is a marketplace. Like, for example, I think premium bonds. I think there's an amazing idea there, which is essentially getting people to save money is really hard. And if you're offering a 5% interest rate, it's too abstract. The benefits are too far away to interest people. Premium bonds have got this amazing idea of get people to save by offering an immediate and potentially very large but variable reward. Now that taps into two massive behavioral science principles of present bias. We care about what happens to us now, far, far less interested in what's going to happen to us in the future. And this idea that we're more interested in variable than fixed rewards. But because premium bonds aren't very sexy, because it's not a hugely booming brand, I think people unfairly castigate one of its approaches. And I think that's something that I reckon if we were to meet in 10 years' time, there will be a savings brand that has applied that with a bit more creativity, theatricality, and done it brilliantly, and everyone will start copying it. So I don't know. I think there could be a fourth book in the pipeline, which will sell 5 copies.
Yeah. Cool. Well, let's dive into some of these case studies then. So I think, one of them that really stood out for me is Red Bull, because we often talk about Red Bull as being a brilliant example of a brand who has used content to become a broadcaster. And there's such a great effect off the back of that. But then, reading your book around the origins of the story of Red Bull, how, the way it tastes and the size and the pricing, it's just so fascinating how it actually became such a distinct brand in itself. So could you take us through a little bit around that chapter and why it was so effective?
Yeah, there's a few interesting bits that Red Bull have done. I think one of the least appreciated, though, revolves around the can size. So you go back to when Red Bull launched, they were charging a very significant premium to other soft drinks. And I think it would have been stillborn as a brand if they had put their very expensive drink in exactly the same can size as Pepsi or Coke. And this is something that, Rory Sullivan's talked about brilliantly in his book Alchemy. Because, the can size of a Coca-Cola is 330 mils. It's like a squat fat can. And if Red Bull had put their drink in a similarly sized can, you would have immediately compared prices. £1 for Red Bull, 50 pence for Coke. Red Bull would have looked expensive. But by putting it in this tall, cylindrical, smaller can, I think 250 or 275 mils, because it's visually different, you break the comparison set with other soft drinks, and people's willingness to pay becomes free floating. Now, that, I think, that insight about the different shaped cans taps into this idea that psychologists call price relativity. So essentially, it's the argument that when people are thinking about what is a fair price to pay, what they don't do, because it's too complicated, is think to themselves, well, how much happiness, how much utility am I going to get from drinking this can of Red Bull? Then they think back to their willingness to pay per unit of utility. They do the maths, and that's their estimated value. Now, people don't do that because it's a ludicrously complex calculation. And a theme of behavioral science is that people are cognitive misers. So that's a phrase from Susan Fiske at Princeton. And it's essentially the argument that we have evolutionary, we've evolved essentially to ration deep considered thought. Because from an evolutionary sense, energy is a scarce resource and thinking is energy intensive and it's effortful. So we've evolved to avoid deep reflective thought most of the time and instead make quick snap decisions. So weighing up the absolute value of a product is a complex calculation. And what we do when we're faced with complex calculations to save energy is essentially replace them with simpler ones that give us an almost as good answer. And when it comes to price, the simple question is, what have I paid for something similar? And if this new item is more, it's bad value. If this new item is less, it's good value. So a fundamental piece of Red Bull's success was managing to break this comparison with the far cheaper world of soft drinks. Now, that one, I can imagine a lot of people are rolling their eyes and thinking, well, that's a reasonable argument, but I'm sure people could put lots of other plausible ideas together. But the great thing with behavioral science is nothing is ever based on logic or rationality alone. Everyone has to prove their ideas in experiments. So what Michael and I did, I think it was 2022 we did this one, we tried to test the concept of price relativity with Ben & Jerry's ice cream. So we got a group of people together and everyone was shown a tub of Ben & Jerry's ice cream for $3.99 and everyone was asked how good value it was. The twist, though, is that some people saw it compared with Walmart ice cream for $1.99. Other people saw the Ben & Jerry's compared with Halo Top, a very expensive premium brand, for $4.99. Now, when people were asked how good value the Ben & Jerry's was, you saw a wildly different pattern. The group that saw the Ben & Jerry's compared to the cheap Walmart, 27% thought it was good value. The group who saw it compared to the expensive Halo Top, you go up to 41% of people think it's good value. So you get this 52% swing in the proportion of people who think the brand is good value, even though everyone is seeing exactly the same brand, exact same price, exactly the same size. That finding corroborates this idea of our perception of value being relative rather than absolute. And if people buy into that as an idea, then suddenly, as businesses, as brands, as marketers, you've got this amazing opportunity. Because what it suggests is you can radically increase people's willingness to pay if you change their mental comparison set. So go back to Red Bull. What 99.9% of marketers have done is launch in cans that are shaped and sized exactly like standard soft drinks. It would have weighed down willingness to pay. The genius of Red Bull, I think, was around this completely distinctive can shape, that it broke these unhelpful price comparisons and let people's willingness to pay float free. So yeah, that's, I think, for all the things that Red Bull did, that's the least discussed, but probably the most beneficial.
Yeah. And I think, it's really interesting you talk about that because we've been on a bit of a journey recently around how many ideas we'd send over to a client. And we initially were like, if you send too many ideas over, they just get overwhelmed by choice and they can't really make a decision. So let's just send two. And then I think it's a few years ago, we watched a conference where you were talking to the IPA, I think, around, and you were talking about price anchoring and price relativity with
that was a while ago. Yeah.
And you were talking about how nice the Tesco's beer tasted if it was, nice and cool in the fridge. It was only 99p.
I may have been stretching credibility there with that one.
Yeah. Not shaming you on here. Like, by the way, Richard Cheap's really, really cheap beer. But we then started going into this kind of more value-based pricing, and actually that's been a bit of a journey. And on one hand, it's kind of worked for us. There've been some quite fiery conversations with CMOs where they've been like, "How dare you put an idea in that's that large?" But then they kind of say, "But this middle route actually looks really reasonable, and it's still double what they gave us the budget for." But I think that point around the comparison sets and the differentiation is key, isn't it? Because if you kind of are still the same as all your competitors, and then you're going in with this value pricing and you're up here, it doesn't work as well.
Yeah, I think so. Price relativity is this kind of broad concept. We come up with an idea of what we're prepared to pay by creating this mental comparison of products. It's a relative judgment, not an absolute one. That's the kind of broad idea. What you're talking about is a kind of a subset of this idea, often known as extremeness aversion. So it's the idea that as an agency, let's say you take two prices to people. You've got them, the bronze package and the silver package. Well, that silver package looks a bit expensive. Let's say it's £200 and the bronze one's £100. Well, it looks like it's a £100 premium. But if you go to the same client, but with three options, bronze at 100, silver at 200, gold at 1,000, suddenly you have reframed how people approach silver, even though it's the same cost. Because you have this comparison with that super premium gold package, now people can think to themselves, well, I'm saving £800 by taking out this silver package. You know, it's a really, really simple technique, but never go with one price. Give people three prices, three different offerings of different quality and different strengths, but don't expect to sell the most expensive one regularly. Now, the role of it is to make that super premium one is just to make everything else look a bit better value. Now, that idea of extreme subversion, it's not speculation again. There was 1993 work by Amos Tversky. He did it with electrical goods, cameras. Richard Thaler's done it with popcorn in cinemas. Dilip Soman's done it with coffee. I've done experiments recently with transmission, where we looked at professional services, and every single time you see the same result. If you offer people bronze and silver, you get a small proportion going silver. If you go bronze, silver, gold, the proportion picking silver over bronze jumps up. And it's a great way to get people to pay a bit more.
And then thinking about, like, you know, talking about professional services, that's definitely the type of client that we work with as well. And you know, in a lot of these principles, they do apply across. It's not just marketing, it's not just products, is it? You can actually apply a lot of these nudges. It's all moving behavior, right? So in terms of that, the comparison set, thinking about that in a B2B environment, have you done a study where you've really seen a B2B brand or a professional services brand, something that's kind of, or a financial brand, really change how they're seen compared to their competitors?
Yes. So with that, the experimentation I've done has been around extremeness aversion. And you see just the same results amongst professionals as you do consumers. That, I think, is a pretty standard finding. So whether it's the illusion of effort, distinctiveness, simple language, I've done lots of experiments where I've taken an existing academic insight that's been run on the nationally representative groups, and I've rerun them often with transmission for this Yes Advantage report we did. We reran them with a professional audience. And generally, 9 times out of 10, maybe 8 times out of 10, you see the same results. Just because you walk through an office door, the biases in your head don't suddenly change. Now, if anything, I think you could argue that professionals are more prone to some of these behavioural science findings, because there is often an argument that people are prone to being influenced by behavioural science principles in situations of uncertainty. Now, if you think about some consumer products where behavioural science is well proven, like FMCG goods, cans of Coke, bags of crisps. Now, these are things you buy every single day, or you buy regularly, a couple of times a week. Now, people know their preferences, and yet their biases still work. But then compare it to a professional decision. Now, professional decisions tend to be far more bespoke. They're far less, cookie cutter commodity. Generally, what you're seeing in front of you is different from the offering you saw like 6 months prior. So if anything, I think these principles are more likely to work in professional settings.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit around the Apple chapter, because Apple are a great brand to have a look at anyway. But I think, what I really liked about that chapter was it's taking a really complex product, and this is talking around when they were launching the iPod and really simplifying it and making it relatable. you talk about concreteness in that, right? So can you take us through that principle and that study and see why that's so powerful?
So this was one of my favourite chapters, and it's quite a wide-ranging one, but the bit that you're referencing talks about the launch of the iPod. And then if you go back to that kind of era, what was it, about 25 years ago? People were lots of tech brands were trying to launch completely new bits of kit, MP3 players. And they all wanted to convey the benefit of memory and storage. Now, the great thing with MP3 player was you could fit your whole CD collection essentially on it. You could fit all your music onto this tiny device. But what most brands did, whether this was Sony or Philips, is they talked in very abstract terms. They said, we've got these wonderful new machines. They have got 256 megabytes of memory. Now, the problem with that is it is very, very abstract language. And a consistent finding of behavioural science is people are bloody awful at remembering abstract concepts. For something to become easily understandable and very memorable, it's much better to use language that people can visualize, what psychologists call concrete language. Things, physical items, anything that people can picture in their mind's eye. It's a lot more sticky. So you think about Apple back in that era. Yes, they wanted to convey the same objective of memory and storage, but what they did is translate those abstract objectives into concrete visualizable language. The strapline they used so brilliantly was 1,000 songs in your pocket. And because you can picture the iPod being nestled in your pocket, it makes that message lodge in people's minds. Now, again, this is not speculation. There's a classic study from 1972 by Ian Begg. So he was this great Canadian psychologist at the University of Western Ontario. And he recruits a group of people, reads out a long list of 2-word phrases, and he sees what people can remember later on. And the twist in the experiment is that half of the phrases he reads out are abstract. So things like subtle fault, impossible amount. These are concepts that it's hard to visualize. The other half of the phrases he reads out are concrete ones. White horse, square door, physical things you can picture. And what Begg finds is that on average, people remember 9% of the abstractions, but 36% of the concrete phrases. Now, that is a massive difference. Business can flourish on a little 1 or 2% improvement. This is a 4-fold difference in memorability. It's one of the biggest impacts I've seen in a memory study. And according to Begg, the reason's very simple. Vision's the most powerful of our senses. And so if you use language people can visualize, it's very, very sticky. If you use abstract language, it's completely forgettable. So I think that is a simple technique that could be used far more regularly. Now, for each of our chapters, we picked different biases to use because, it's not going to be a great reading experience if every chapter we repeated the same biases. But you could go back to Red Bull. We didn't in the book, but you could go back to Red Bull and say another brilliant thing they did was exactly the same principle of concreteness. And what would most marketers have done launching Red Bull, this energy drink? Most people would say Red Bull gives you energy. But that would have been very abstract. It would have been forgettable. But of course, what Red Bull actually did so brilliantly was say Red Bull gives you wings. And that's very, very different. It's got the same underlying meaning, but because it uses visualizable language, it's really sticky. You can imagine the wings, you can imagine a person flapping them and flying around. That is a very powerful piece of communication. So yeah, concreteness is I think a theme of some of the best brands, the best copywriters. They use it regularly.
Yeah, and I think when reading about that Apple example, it does just spring back to your mind completely. And you talk about those other brands, and you don't really, and I don't know whether that's because Apple has a serious amount of real estate in my head because they've become omnipresent. But you can just all recall these really clear examples and characters immediately when they're referred to. They're that sticky, right?
Yeah, and this is why we didn't just do a potted history of a brand and then say, here are 6 things you can learn from the brand. Because you're absolutely right. From afar, if you just saw 1,000 songs in your pocket, you knew it was a successful campaign, but was it was it that phrase? Was it the beautiful photography? Was it the weight of media they used? Was it the aura of the brand? It'd be very hard to be clear that it was that particular element that drove success. But if you see Apple behaving amazingly and experiments, peer review control experiments where they just test the principle of concreteness, I think then you can learn from Apple. You can identify using behavioral science the kind of magic ingredients they're using to power success.
Because when you start to understand the principles, you start to see it threaded through all of their work, don't you? Like, that when you have a look at the Apple ad about deleting the text and you've got the lizard coming back to life. I think Orlando talked about that, and that being a fluent device. And it's funny, it sticks in your head, it's got characters. Can you talk a bit about the fluent device as well? We did touch on it with Orlando, but I'd love to go a bit deeper on it and just understand why that's really effective, and crucially, how service, the service industry, B2B, how they can, because characters, it can, and we'll come on to rhyme in a bit, but it can seem a little bit salesy at times. And so it's like, how do we start to put that in, or how do we suggest clients go with that without them saying like, that's not really what we want to do, because we don't, we're not in that realm.
So fluent device is a phrase that Orlando and Wood and System 1 came up with, and they describe it as a character or mascot who is central to the drama of an ad that is used repeatedly on a long-term campaign. Now, they probably say it far more eloquently than that, but that's basically the point. It's a character used repeatedly, and it's central to the drama. Now, they've done some brilliant work. They've looked at, I think, 300 long-term campaigns from the IPA effectiveness database, going all the way back to 1998. And then on 4 metrics, they have compared the campaigns that had a fluent device and the campaigns that didn't. And it's things like market share, profitability, big, important metrics. And for every one of them, there is a significant difference. The campaigns with the fluent device work better. They've done some brilliant reports that are worth downloading if you want that kind of data. Now, I would explain this, and Orlando might well disagree, but I think the reason why these fluent devices work is concreteness. So have a think about fluent devices, the really successful ones, the 118 runner, maybe Howard from the Halifax, the M&M characters, the Geico gecko, Alexander the meerkat. These are all visualizable things that embody certain values. Now think about Begg's experiment and think about compare the market. If you'll compare the market, it is very hard just to convey value for money by talking about this concept in abstract terms. It doesn't work. It doesn't stick in people's minds. But what does stick in people's minds is a talking, Russian accented meerkat. And that physical thing embodies those values. So brands, I think, have certainly been very astute in their communications when they've used fluent devices. But unfortunately, I kind of try to emphasize there the past tense. There used to be a very regularly used advertising technique. We'd have to go and look at the System 1 data, but I'm pretty sure the latest data they've reported on is that 12% of campaigns use a fluent device. It's certainly of that ilk. It might be a bit lower. And I think you go back 30 years and it's more like 25, 30%. So there's this technique that there's a very strong behavioral science principle that shows it works, concreteness. There's some lovely data from System 1 that shows it works. Yet what brands are doing are moving completely the opposite direction. They are ignoring a powerful memory technique because I think they feel it's a bit old-fashioned. But frankly, I don't think that's, what the audience are believing. And what we're, I think, sometimes bad at as an industry is assuming certain facts. People assume these characters and mascots are outdated, but there's no evidence to show that. The evidence shows something very different, that they're great memory techniques and they improve a lot of business metrics. So I think there's this phrase from Richard Feynman, the physicist, where he says, or it might be Bertrand Russell, doesn't really matter. He says every so often it's quite good to hang a question mark on the end of things that we sincerely believe. And, for me, the industry should be thinking far more about some of these techniques that worked so well in the past that we seem to be dismissing.
Yeah. And I think Orlando would argue that it's because of that narrow beam sort of culture we've ended up in that means we're less likely to take a risk or go back to doing some of those things.
Yeah, but my argument would be, I mean, risk is an interesting word. I mean, I think that, if you're really looking at the risk to the brand, and we can come back and discuss risk to the marketer, but the risk to the brand is not being noticed. Most advertising doesn't even get through to people, won't be recalled 5 minutes after being seen. Your biggest risk as an advertiser is not being noticed and not being remembered. Fluent devices are a brilliant way of avoiding that risk. So the risk to me is not having a fluent device, not communicating concretely. I think we sometimes get risk the wrong way around.
Yeah, and combined with that use of humor as well, like that's a really powerful tool to use, and in definitely in our world, like it's really not used as much as it should be.
Yeah,
and
most definitely. And again, I think actually I went to see Orlando speak, and he was talking about the etymology of advertising, and it's from the Latin turn towards. And there's a bloody big clue in the name of advertising as what we need to get people to do. We need to attract people to turn towards whatever we're talking about. And then when you think of it like that, humor, of course, is a very powerful tactic. People want to be amused. They want to engage with something that makes them feel better. They don't want to be browbeaten and made to feel crap. So humor, again, is another technique that advertisers are going in the wrong direction. There's Kantar data. They've published it. It's very easy to find if people Google it. John Boyd's done some lovely work on it recently. And they have looked at the proportion of ads that try and amuse people. I'm emphasizing the word try. You go back to the early 2000s, late 90s, it's more than 50%. Now I think we're down to 32%. Again, advertisers doing the opposite of what is effective. Now, the standard riposte to this is, okay, well, fair enough. You can make people laugh and you get their attention, but I want to show that my brand is value for money. I want to show that we're sophisticated or trustworthy. I want to communicate a completely different metric. But behavioral scientists would say people are being far too literal, that communications don't work in these discrete buckets. There's an idea called the halo effect, which essentially suggests if you manage to imbue your product with one powerful positive metric, all the others will follow. So if that sounds a bit vague, I'll go back to some of the original studies. I'll jump to the 1970s when probably the first decent study was done. So it's 1977, I think, Richard Nisbet, Timothy Wilson. And they get a colleague of theirs. So this is all done in America. And it's a professor who is Belgian and who has quite a strong accent. And they get this professor to record a lecture. So half an hour talk on, I don't know, sunflowers or something. So he gives this lecture and they record two versions. So first version, he is coming across as kind of warm and enthusiastic. Second version, he comes across as cold and mean. So he's just changing his kind of demeanor, but he's not changing the underlying content. Words are the same, logic's the same, but it's just whether he's friendly or unfriendly. So the psychologists get a group of people and then they randomly pick one film to play to the participants. So some people see the friendly professor, some see the unfriendly. Psychologists then question all those participants as to their feelings towards the professor. Now, the first bit of data is bleeding obvious. The people who see the unfriendly professor rate him as a bit mean-spirited and nasty. The people who see the friendly professor rate him as, kind and warm. So far, very obvious. The clever bit of the experiment is they then start picking completely unrelated attributes. So they say to the participants, "Now, what did you think of his looks? Was he good looking or bad looking? What do you think of his accent? What do you think of his mannerisms?" Now, these are things completely unrelated to whether he's friendly or unfriendly. But what you see is this same pattern. The friendly professor is rated as better looking, nicer accent, better demeanor. The argument from the psychologists is what they call the halo effect, which is essentially if you have one dominant characteristic, so in this case, friendliness, people then use that dominant characteristic to rate you on all your other attributes, even if those attributes are unrelated. So if you come across as friendly, you'll also be seen as more trustworthy, more intelligent. If you come across as really beautiful, you'll be seen as more intelligent and trustworthy. It's probably an energy saving technique again. It's complicated to rate people independently on all their different aspects. What's easy is fixate on one thing and then use that as a broad guide. Now, that's the kind of 1970s experimentation. But take that now to the world of marketing. And what this suggests is businesses should think very differently about communications. Don't think about the metric that you want to communicate. Think about what is easy to communicate. So what I mean by that is proving trustworthiness in a, let's say, a 30-second TV ad or a poster. It's very hard. You have to make claims. You have to go out and say, I am trustworthy. And frankly, claims are skeptically received. But now think about humor. It is something you could actually do in a poster or a TV ad. And we are always, as viewers, going to give more weight to actual performance and actual behavior in the ad rather than claims. So I think there's an argument that you try and communicate in a humorous, likable way. And then what you'd expect is all those metrics that are unrelated that you do want to improve, they will follow. So I think you're absolutely right. It's criminally ignored in advertising at the moment.
Yeah, and I think there's something like speaking of comedy, like I tie it back to. So I ran a comedy club for a few years down in the French Riviera, which was quite an interesting kind of like before my time. And you can tie so many of these principles back to. In fact, actually about concreteness, we called it the Riviera Comedy Club because it needed to do exactly what we were doing. Yeah. But when I think about the humor side of it, watching all these different comedians and how they came on with these different personas and their acts, which obviously they rinse and repeat night after night, and seeing how the different audiences warmed to them, or some of them came on very kind of like strong, and they would need to build up from there. And then there's kind of pratfall effect where they sort of take the piss out themselves to begin with. And there's a very common thing in comedy when you get up, you say like, "Oh, I'm a cross between I don't know McFly and someone else," and that gets your first laugh. But you then need to be really good to kind of pull it off afterwards, because if you can die if you don't do it. But it's really interesting connecting a lot of these principles and thinking about those comedians and how they're interacting, because that's all quite similar stuff, right?
Yeah. So the piece I'm fixating on from what you said, it was your very first comment about this variety of comedians, because I think that's absolutely crucial. Comedy and humor are very, very broad. So when people say, "Oh, well, comedy works for FMCG brands, but it doesn't work for business, it doesn't work for serious things," surely the response should be, well, what type of comedy are we talking about? Maybe Mr. Bean's slapstick works in a Snickers ad and it's not going to work for McKinsey, but that doesn't mean the entire breadth of comedy can't work for a professional services company. Think about the Economist ads. Those were comic, but they were witty, intelligent, clever wordplay. So not only did they increase people's willingness to engage, not only did they boost all these unrelated metrics from humor because of the halo effect, what they also did, I think, is double down and additionally emphasize the intelligence of the Economist because the wordplay itself was so clever. And in fact, I think if we were going to write the book again, I'd be tempted to stick an 18th chapter, and now we're talking about it. And I think we should have done the Economist, was it white out of red, red out of white, white out of red campaign.
So let's move on to Liquid Death. I mean, obviously,
Yes.
like an incredible brand story of this sort of completely standing out in the drinks category. And and that distinctive story applies so well in that kind of, the beverages area. Tell us a bit around that story, because it was a designer, right, at a gig.
Yeah, a guy called Mike Cesario. He'd worked at various different agencies, and he had this idea that if you want people to be more environmentally friendly, so not having plastic, if you want people to drink water rather than soft drinks, something that's healthy for them, he said, why does everyone always assume you have to focus on the kind of duty and the ethics? Why not focus on appeal and desirability? So his kind of first argument was, well, why don't we learn from candies and crisps and soft drinks? Why should the devil have all the best tunes, essentially? And when launching the brand, he completely ignored the category conventions of the time. So if you think of your Evians and your Perriers and all sorts like that, they tend to be, clear bottles so you can see the liquid, ads full of alpine imagery or kind of yoga mums, beautiful green scenes. Cesario ignores all that with Liquid Death, and instead he behaves more like a heavy metal band or a craft beer. So the ads are outrageously over the top. They're very kind of dark, bloody humor. They really push the boundaries. And it's a phenomenal technique. Very, very successful in America. I know there's been problems in the UK, but in America, Cesario says it's the fastest ever growing non-alcoholic brand. And I think this idea of identifying category conventions and then splitting them into two buckets, ones which are there for a very good reason, leave those alone. But most are there just for tradition's sake. If you break them, you are much, much more likely to be noticed. So that's, again, not speculation. The original research actually went back to 1933. So there was a German psychologist called Hedwig von Restorff, wonderful name. And she does a simple experiment. Well, it's basically like this. I'm bastardizing it slightly. But she gives people lists of words. So you might get this A4 bit of paper with 10 phrases on. 9 will be from one category. Let's say it's animals, dog, weasel, elephant, kangaroo. And then one of the words, or maybe 2 of the words, will be from a completely different category, like furniture. So it could be chair or table. She gives people a few minutes to read through these lists. She then takes the lists away, and then she asks people what they can recall. And she sees a very clear pattern. If you are given a list that is mainly composed of animals with a couple of bits of furniture, people will remember the furniture. Whereas if you give people lists that are mainly composed of furniture items with a couple of animals thrown in that setting, it will be the animals they remember. Her argument is we are hardwired to notice what is distinctive. So this became known as the von Restorff effect or the isolation effect. And now bring this back to Liquid Death. This is a challenger brand, it's a launch brand, budgets that are trivial compared to Evian and Perrier. But what they managed to do is to make every one of their dollars count far, far more by being much more likely to be noticed, much more likely to be remembered, because they broke so many category conventions. So that, to me, I think if you look at one thing that Liquid Death have done, I think that's probably the key principle.
And if you're a Fortune 500 brand, how do you, obviously if you're Fortune 500, you're standing out in the market because of your depth of experience and number of years doing it, but it does make sense. The distinctiveness side of things does make sense from a startup point of view, or if you're trying to disrupt. If you're a large corporate, would you then need to create a fighter brand to try and disrupt yourself? Or does distinctiveness still work if you're trying to kind of stand out once you're one of the big boys?
Yeah, so the point is, if you want to be noticed, it's more likely to happen if you're distinctive. Now, that is a fundamental trait of human nature. Doesn't matter if it's a professional services, it doesn't matter if it's FMCG, it doesn't matter if it's alcohol. We are fundamentally more likely to notice something if it's distinctive to its surroundings. Now, that doesn't have to mean it's disruptive. It doesn't have to be copying Liquid Death with these very outrageous approaches. Now, it could be something, about using a different color palette or a different tone of voice. It's more around standing out from whatever surrounds you. Now, you certainly could say that that principle is equally valid, whatever category we're discussing. But I think there is a slight difference if you're a Fortune 500 company. If you have advertising budgets 10 times the size of your competition or 50% larger, you can get away with behaving like the market because you're just going to steamroller them through sheer repetition and weight of exposure. Now, it will work because you've got this luxury of larger budgets, but it doesn't mean it's the most efficient and effective thing to do. So von Restorff effect is valid for every situation, but I think when it comes to the necessity being the mother of invention, it's more likely to occur on challenger brands because of the pressures of them. They don't have enough budget to do the more standard route, but it doesn't mean it can't be used by those large brands. I think there's a distinction.
Yeah, and I think when you apply it to kind of our offering and the agency landscape, there's a lot of production companies out there. It's a very fragmented market. I think a lot of them are all saying the same thing. And so we've been trying really hard for years, actually, to try and be distinct, trying to separate ourselves out from it. So it does seem to me that the bolder that difference is, the better, right? So you've got to be quite brave with how you try and stand out from your competitors.
But again, it comes back to this use of the word bravery or risk. And I think there's a danger with positioning it this way. So I would always say, well, brave for who? Now, we'll come to the marketer themselves, because I think you might be right there. But for the brand, it's not brave to be distinctive. You're more likely to be noticed. This is an absolute fundamental of communication. You cannot change people's beliefs in your brand if you aren't noticed. The risky thing for most people, unless they have this luxury of ridiculously large budgets, the risky thing is that you put out a bland piece of messaging that apes the category conventions and that you don't get noticed. That's the genuine risk. So I disagree with the use of the word risk or bravery when it comes to the brand perspective. Where I think I would agree with you is, unfortunately, as things currently stand, there might be an element of bravery and risk-taking on the individual marketer's behalf. Because unfortunately, if you ape category conventions and your brand launch, let's say, is a failure, let's say you are launching a beer brand and you do a massive football sponsorship. If that's your decision as the marketer, now if the brand fails, people will turn around and have an inquest into why it went wrong. You can say, well, look, all these other massive successful brands have used a football sponsorship. Surely this was the right thing. Failure must lay elsewhere. So it gives you a plausible alibi. Imagine that situation: you're launching your new beer and you do something wildly different, like you sponsor a table tennis brand. Even if in reality it was a great thing to do, when it comes to the inquest, it's harder to defend because there's no examples of other people doing it. You don't have the same internal defensive logic that you can use. So I would always discriminate between what is risky for a brand, and I would argue being undistinctive is very risky for a brand. What is risky for a marketer, I think unfortunately you're right, and it actually sometimes is doing the right thing, because then it's harder sometimes to defend if things go wrong, and there's always a chance things go wrong.
And how does that tie in with the consistency element? Because you talk about that in that chapter as well. And I love that there's a System 1 study on compound creativity, which I roll out all the time at the moment because I think it's brilliant. But obviously, you need to find something that's working. You need that fluent device. And once you double down on that, and then you can iterate on it. So I think about Go Compare, the opera singer. And then, eventually we've now got ads where he's out of the twirly moustache and he's just a Welsh bloke talking, about something going wrong in his house. So that idea though of sticking with it. I mean, we are guilty of chasing shiny new creative or doing different things. And I'm sure it's part of human nature to seek novelty, isn't it? So I think there's an element of that, trying to kind of pull ourselves in line and trying to stick with an idea. But what would your advice be for how to create that consistency and iterating on a creative idea? Because that can feel, again, like a risk, but maybe it's not a risk, but I don't know, that just sticking with something seems to be quite hard.
Yeah. So firstly, I think that some people think there's this contradiction between consistency and distinctiveness. But actually, distinctiveness doesn't mean you are constantly evolving and being distinctive within your brand. It means distinctive versus what everyone else is doing. So, Geico Gecko, massive insurance brand that inspired Compare the Market, I think. And Geico, this big insurance brand, they have a Fluent Device, the Geico Gecko. Now, they have had the Geico Gecko for, I think, about 30 years. So they are
Wow.
consistent in the use of the gecko, but it's completely different from what everyone else does in the category. No one else has talking lizards. So it's distinctive versus the competition, but they use it consistently. So these two things, I think, go together very well. You know, and in the liquid death argument, this tone of voice they have of being an outrageous heavy metal style communicator, that is consistent ever since they've launched. But that style is very different from an Evian or a Perrier. So consistently distinctive, I think, is the argument. And we're talking about tone of voice and style. It's not that Geico Gecko runs exactly the same ad for 30 years. They have the consistent part of the gecko, but of course in different situations, different scenarios, different areas. So you've got this theme of repetition, but with kind of some variance within it. So I think that's the kind of the first bit. The compound creativity is really interesting. I think the System 1 reports are brilliant. That one, when I first heard about it, I was a little skeptical because to me, there's a survivorship bias. If you, and this is just from a cursory reading, so I don't know the study as well as I probably should. But if you say a campaign that's run for 10 years, or campaigns that run from 10 years tend to be more successful than campaigns that only run for a year, the most logical explanation for that is survivorship bias. If you launch a campaign and it's amazing, you keep on running it. If you launch a campaign and it's bloody awful, you turn it off. So just saying longer running campaigns are more effective than short ones, I don't think actually proves anything. However, put that argument to one side for a second. You then look at experiments and you can start to see this repetition does have benefits. So the guy that came up with this idea was called Robert Zając, and I'm pausing there because I don't know how to bloody pronounce his name. It's like a Polish-American, super famous psychologist called Zając, I think, essentially. And he came up with this idea of the mere exposure effect. So back in 1968, he's working at the University of Michigan, and he recruits a group of people, and he gives them like books, and people have to flick through these books. And on the first variant of the study, every page there is a picture of a face. And people put a few minutes, let's say 15 minutes, to flick through the book. They get to the end, and then there is a list of all the faces that appeared, and people have to say how good looking the faces are. Now, the twist in the experiment is some of the faces were shown just once, some of the faces twice, some 3, some 5, some 20 times. And what Zion shows is that there is this consistent pattern. The ratings of the faces are seen as more beautiful, more attractive if people have seen them multiple times. Now, he calls this the mere exposure effect because he's saying they are becoming more beautiful, not because people are getting more information about them, but simply through the act of repetition. That was a one-off study. He then repeats it with Turkish words. So he's doing this with an American audience. They don't know what these Turkish words mean. Does the same thing. People flick through these books. Sometimes they say a word once, sometimes 15, sometimes 20 times. Again, when they are asked to say what they think that word means, there is this pattern that the more they're exposed to words, the more positive a meaning they tend to give it. He does these experiments in lots of different variants. I think Chinese characters was the other one. And it keeps on seeing the same pattern. And he argues that there might well be an evolutionary angle to this that if we are exposed to a stimulus and it doesn't hurt us, then we over time become warmer to it. We see it as safe and not being a threat. So he argues that over time, familiarity breeds contentment rather than contempt. That the Proverbs got it the wrong way around. So I think if you look at the great work system one I've done, and you think of Zionch's work, then I think together it's a more compelling case that repetition is an undervalued element of a brand success. Marketers chop and change things far, far too regularly. And what they should realize is that you should be sticking to the same approach unless there is a very, very good reason not to, because by doing something radically different, you will lose this benefit of the mere exposure effect. So unless there is a massive upside from your kind of strategic pivot or your creative pivot, you are not going to benefit. If you are just going to replace it with a similarly powerful approach in kind of abstracting, you will actually see a loss because you haven't got this benefit, the mere exposure effect. Look at some of the greatest brands. Look at Kit Kat. I think that phrase, have a break, have a Kit Kat, I think that might be the 1930s, 1940s, maybe 1950s. It is a phenomenally old line that they've used again and again and again. It's one of the world's most successful chocolate bars. But they haven't just gone out with black and white posters for 70 years. They've shown wonderful variations and creativity, but it's all on this same clear theme. And that's what I think you want to be thinking about with the mere exposure effect. Don't laboriously stick to the Zionch study. Now, I think the way of interpreting this in a commercial business setting is have a very, very clear, underlying principle and expression, but then there you've got this bandwidth to vary on it. And Kit Kat would be a classic example of someone doing that.
Creativity flourishes within boundaries, right? So if you've got that kind of, you're working within that, you can come up with really good. Whereas if it's completely open, it's much harder to be creative. And the other thing I love about that study is they say stick to the same agency, which is music to my ears, because they say if you stick to the same agency, you're more likely to see large business effects.
Again, I'm dangerously close to speculating on a report I don't know very well. But I would question that again, because if you say, agencies that have been around for 50 years with a client tend to outperform those who've been around a year, well, isn't it the same argument as most likely? If an agency is continually putting their best people on it, they're doing a brilliant job, you don't get rid of them. If they do a bloody awful job, you get rid of them after years. So there is a danger of, I think, survivorship bias. But that said, I think the point of you need the output to be have this element of consistency and repetition. And the danger is if you bring in a new agency, then I think they will feel a pressure to do something differently.
Yeah, exactly. They're saying we have to go in a different direction to prove their worth once they come in. So
it's the same problem with bringing in new marketing directors. They feel a personal pressure to change things because they're thinking about their next job. And if you take over Kit Kat and you say, well, I just did the same thing as the last one.
It doesn't look great on the resume.
And your next employer might look poorly on that. But just because that next employer is mistaken doesn't mean that's a justification to change everything up from the brand's perspective.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a bit about Pringles, because I think this ties in again with the Fluent Device and doing something, the rhyme of once you pop, you can't stop is really effective. And the idea of sonic identity and designing for the senses I love. So if you could talk a bit around that chapter, and then we can get into the kind of layering.
So I quite often write about brands or categories that I enjoy. So there's quite a lot of booze in there. And then you've got Pringles for the crisps.
It's just a good night in.
If I have a dietary weakness, it is crisps. So to put this into perspective, when it was my 40th birthday, one of my best friends knew how much I love crisps. And she bought me this giant box and I opened it up, and within it, there were 40 individually wrapped bags of crisps, different brands, different flavors. And I still think it is the single best present I've ever received. And my 50th birthday is in a couple of days. My good friend can't make it, unfortunately. I think it's her dad's 85th birthday on the same day. But she's come round to the house and she's given me an even bigger box. And all my dreams will come true and I'll let you know what happens if I've got 50 individually wrapped bags of crisps this time. So sorry, that might be the slightly biased reason why Pringles appear. But the more serious reason and the more important reason for marketers is the slogan that they use for so long. Once you pop, you can't stop. Now, what that uses very obviously is a rhyme. And there is some fascinating work that suggests that if you use a rhyming phrase, it's more believable than a non-rhyming one. So mid-90s, Matthew McGlone does this lovely experiment with Jessica Toffig-Bash. And they recruit a group of people and they give them a list of fake proverbs. And everyone gets a slightly varied list. The lists are always randomized to make it a decent experiment. Some people, though, will get a rhyming version of a proverb. Woes unite foes. Some people will get a non-rhyming proverb. Woes unite enemies. Now, the important thing is the logic, the underlying statement is exactly the same. All that changes is it expressed as a rhyme or as a non-rhyme. What the psychologists do is get people to rate the credibility, the kind of insightfulness of all these proverbs. Are they true? Are they a fair reflection of humanity? So people rate the proverbs, and then the psychologists take all this data and they compare what the scores are for the non-rhyming and rhyming versions. And I think from memory, it's a 17%. It's something of that order, a 17% variance in believability. The argument from the psychologists is people are conflating two things mistakenly. They're conflating ease of processing with truthfulness. So because rhymes are very easy to process, people assume they are true. Interestingly, as a little follow-up to the study, the psychologists go back to each of the participants and say, okay, well, look, some of these phrases you looked at rhymed, some didn't. Did the rhyme influence your evaluation of the credibility of the phrase? I think of all the participants they asked, only one person said, yeah, the rhyme had a bit of an effect. Everyone else said, oh, no. These rhymes don't affect me. I'm just interested in the kind of content and the sensibleness of the underlying statement. So there's a part here about rhymes boost believability, but there's also another interesting bit, which is people are bloody awful at understanding what actually influences them. Okay, so you should have deep disquiet about what a focus group says or what a standard survey tells you. Because if you kind of naively and directly question people about why they buy Red Bull, Apple, Liquid Death or Pringles, they'll give you loads of answers, but most of them will send you in the wrong direction. So I think there's an interesting conundrum here of whether on balance, market research helps or hinders the industry. It can be absolutely bloody amazing, but you need a really good researcher to kind of go to quite strong methods to counterbalance this tendency for people to mislead. So it can be absolutely brilliant. And you work with great agencies you've mentioned, brilliant people like Orlando Wood, and I think you'll get to amazing answers. But if you just send out a survey and take it at face value, you'll end up in a very bad place.
Yeah, it's full of self-reports, isn't it? And then you've got the kind of thoughts bubbling up through a cognitive layer cake where of biases, where they suddenly start saying what they think you want them to say. And
yeah, so there's active lying, that's definitely true. But there's also this phrase from psychologists called confabulating. And a confabulation is when people try and tell you the truth because they don't know their own motivations. They end up giving you a misleading answer. I'm sure most of those people were honestly feeling back. They didn't think the rhyme had influenced them. It's too subtle an influence. But just because they didn't think it influenced them doesn't negate the actual impact. But with that study, I think we probably wouldn't have done a chapter on increasing believability due to rhyme because it's not that big a swing in impact. But when I read that original study, I thought to myself, well, this is interesting. Because if you go back to the 1970s, the 1990s, you can remember a hell of a lot of ads that had rhyming straplines. Was it Less Bother with a Hover? Don't Be Vague, Ask for Hay. That's the 1930s ones. Pringles up to the 90s. Once you pop, you can't stop. There's an awful lot of these phrases that have been discontinued, but that still stick in people's minds. Coughs and sneezes spread diseases. I think the original American one was from like 1917. I think it was the Spanish flu, the Spanish influenza that it was trying to help prevent. It came out in Britain post World War II, and people can still remember these phrases, even though they might have been born after they were originally wrote. So I reran McGlone and Topic Bash's study a few years ago with a completely unrepresentative audience. We gave them the phrases in the morning, and then we asked them what they could remember in the evening. So kind of an 8-hour difference. And people were twice as likely to remember the phrases that rhymed as the non-rhyming ones. So yes, this has a boost in believability, but I think the much bigger impact is for brands. When it is so hard to get people to remember what you're telling them, there is a much, much bigger impact in memory. And then what we did in Hacking the Human Mind, working with a great team at Cantor, so Nicky Morley, John Paulson, and a few others, we reran that rhyme study with a proper representative audience, and we saw similar results. So again, it's one of these techniques that is proven to work in terms of memorability. Yet again, the advertising industry is moving away from it. I did a study, and I'm desperately trying to remember who I did this with. So we should probably put it in the show notes, so I don't claim full credit. It was two of us. But we went to the News UK have this giant repository of all the papers going, all the Times, the Suns, going back for like 50, 60 years. And we just took random copies throughout the years. And what we saw was this really clear decline in the use of rhyme. Now, you go back to the 1970s, and I think it was like 20 or 30% that were using rhyme as a strapline. Now I think it's more like 5 or 10%. And humor, fluent devices, and rhyme, these are three really powerful techniques that the industry's stopped using. It's crazy.
Yeah, it could be so much more fun. Well, actually, my WhatsApp groups that's the WhatsApp group that has been the most successful was Thirsty Thursdays, when we all met to go to the pub. That's the one that stuck. Does it work with a sort of half rhyme? Does it work with, is it okay for it to be subtle, or does it need to be full rhyme?
So good question. So yeah, because Thirsty Thursday, and now I'm not an English graduate. Would that? So my wife will be, she'll be recoiling in horror if she hears this. So she's a copywriter. Is it an alliteration?
It is an alliteration. Yeah, it's not a rhyme there. Yeah.
So Joanna Stanley and I we reran the McGlone and Topic Bash study, but rather than giving people proverbs that rhymed, we gave them fake proverbs that alliterated. And these actually were alliterations, because my wife was, I think, involved in checking our English. And you do see an impact. Alliterating phrases, more likely to be believed, more likely to be remembered, but it is a much smaller swing. So it was double for boost to memorability if you used a rhyming phrase. Alliteration, I think you're talking a 15 or 20% improvement. So yes, it has an impact, but it's just not as powerful as rhyme. And it's an interesting one here, because I'm conscious that if copywriters are listening, they might roll their eyes and think, well, this is bloody obvious. People have known this for thousands of years. Go back to, Homer's poems. They are full of concrete imagery. Was it the wine, Red Sea, or whatever they kind of talk about, things like that. It's full of concrete imagery. So great writers have always known this. But my counter would be, okay, look, maybe great writers know this, but if you open a newspaper or you look at your emails that come from brands, the actual product, the end creation, often ignores these principles. So something is going wrong between the copywriters and the end product. And I think what often happens is the experts, the copywriters, know these principles, but they're failing to persuade the gatekeepers, the marketing team. because the marketing team aren't interested in, George Orwell's 10 rules of writing. That feels completely uncommercial. But if you can take them through the experiments in the book, take them through the peer-reviewed, observed work of McGlone and Toffebash, you can move away from this slightly woolly, subjective conversation to very clear, proven data that backs up what you were probably always wanted to do. So I think there is a real use of behavioral science to get the ideas that the experts are suggesting actually into the wild by giving them this neutral support to persuade others.
Do you think there's the obsession with data has hampered the success of some of these principles? Is that why we're in?
It depends what data. I mean, running an experiment is data. The numbers that you get from an experiment is data. So it's like having an opinion on humor. Having an opinion on data, it's too broad a category to say something definitive about it. The argument should be, what is the data that we need to create to actually improve campaigns? And I would argue the data that comes maybe from a focus group that is poorly run, or the direct questioning in a survey, that data is really dangerous. It can send brands off in completely the wrong direction. But the data that comes from an observed experiment, now that can have huge positive impact. The brands that are in the book, yes, they are all commercial, but they're often examples of brilliant bits of communication. Those underlying themes can be used in all sorts of different ways. Now, this wasn't a brand in the book, but we touched on it earlier, which is The Economist. So we talked about how they used wit and humor to get more engagement, to improve how they were viewed in all sorts of areas. But the other thing they do with the particular type of humor they had is use a technique called the generation effect. So this is the idea from two University of Toronto psychologists. I think it was Graff and Slamecker. So it's either Peter Graff and Norman Slamecker, or Norman Graff and Peter Slamecker. And back in the late 70s, they do a simple study, or I'll simplify it very slightly, but give you the directionally right thing. They give people lists of words, and some people see the full word. So you might get a list of 10 animals: dog, cat, weasel, elephant. Other people get basically the same lists, but there's a little change. The psychologists have removed one, maybe two letters. So you'd get D-O blank, C-A-T. Sorry, C blank T. Yeah. And all these groups are asked to later on recall the information. And what the psychologists find is that the group who had to generate the answer, the group who saw the words with a missing letter or two, they remember 15% more. And essentially their argument is, if you put a little bit of effort, a little bit of processing power into interacting with the list, if you have to generate the answer yourself, then that becomes stickier. So they call this the generation effect. Now you think about The Economist, and what they could have done is just say, if you don't read The Economist, you're a failure. Well, firstly, that would have been offensive. But secondly, it would have left no room for the audience. It would have just told people what to think. But what they, of course, actually did was pose a little puzzle. Now, I don't read The Economist was the classic ad, big posters. Said, I don't read The Economist, management trainee, age 42. They set a little puzzle that needs to be interpreted. There is an active role for the audience. And that element of active engagement, that lodges the message in people's mind. So you come back to learning and development, and where it goes wrong, I think, is where people think if they just transmit information, that information will be received. I think actually that might be the fundamental flaw in bad marketing. We assume what we say and what people hear are the same thing. What you need to do is leave, I think, a role for the audience. Rather than telling people what they should believe, get them actively coming up with a solution themselves. That I think would be a great way of translating some of these commercial tactics that use behavioral science biases into learning and development. Absolutely, you could do that.
Yeah. Yeah, it goes back to that idea of leaving enough space in the trap for the mouse.
Yes, Saki, yes.
Solving that puzzle, yeah. So just quickly, I just want, before we wrap up, I just want to touch on the conclusion in the book I found really helpful, because that in itself, it really starts to talk about, who was that doctor? Dr. Semmelweis, the doctor who said, you need to wash your hands to stop, this these germs killing people. Tragic story, but I thought that was a fascinating part of the book, because it really talks about how to talk to clients about this, how to start selling it in. And I think you talk about using the studies, right? And how to actually convince people is to go back to the studies.
Yeah, it's genuinely is a tragic story. Cutting it very short, Semmelweis essentially manages to reduce infant mortality phenomenally in a maternity ward by getting people to wash their hands. Now, previously, doctors have been coming from the morgue, cutting up bodies, coming straight to delivering babies, and unsurprisingly, many of those babies died. There's something shocking. It was about the same odds of surviving in some of the Vienna maternity wards as playing, Russian roulette. Now, Semmelweis, he has slightly weird kind of theories to explain this, but he gets right to the core point, which is some disease is being spread. Everyone needs to wash their hands. Manages to absolutely collapse the rate of infant mortality, reduces it phenomenally. But the tragedy is he can't then persuade anyone else to adopt this technique. He eventually goes basically mad. His wife puts him into a mental institute because of the kind of sheer horror of solving one of the world's great crises and not being believed. And in the nastiest of all ironies, when he's put into the mental institute, he doesn't want to go willingly, unsurprisingly. There is a fight with the guards, and he ends up dying from a sepsis that essentially he'd shown how you could avoid. So it's this horrible story of basically having an idea is not enough. If you want to persuade people and you try and argue something from authority, you're not often going to succeed. So these biases these experiments have a phenomenal use. Rather than going and trying to persuade a client to become distinctive based on your personal beliefs and your charisma, go to that client, take them through the von Restorff effect, take them through the methodology, take them through the results. And because you're using this robust, peer-reviewed observed experiment, it is much, much more persuasive. What I've found is that generally it switches the conversation from should we be distinctive to how can we be distinctive. Now, there is an amazing opportunity, I think, for agencies and people within marketing departments to use these experiments to more successfully translate the ideas they have into action.
Yeah. Yeah, and just like having those conversations with clients, it's also a really interesting thing to talk about as well. And then you see them lighting up, and then, as you say, trying to figure out how to apply it. So yeah, really useful to use that to try and sell it in if you're going to go down this direction. I highly advise that people read Hacking the Human Mind. It's been great to talk to you. Thank you so much for your time. We'd love to have you back on again in the future when you've written that next book.
All jokes aside, because my wife is a copywriter, we have actually been talking about a fourth book, and we're not going to go down the world's worst brands and what you can learn from them. What I am thinking is a book about how you can apply these principles at a more micro scale. So if you've got a side hustle, if you've got a cafe, if you've got a yoga studio you're trying to sell, because I've always thought about the application of these ideas for massive brands. I think there's an opportunity to apply this, when you've got a marketing budget of £15 or you haven't got anything. So I think that actually might be the next one.
Yeah, that would be really interesting. I did also want to ask one last question. It's our audience of one question that we ask every single episode. So when you're writing a book or when you're communicating, they say it's quite useful to have one person in your mind and picturing that person who you're communicating to. Who is that person for you, and how does that change your process or how you write?
So I have heard people say that. I've heard Warren Buffett say it. I think Bob Levinson, who did some of the classic VW ads, they would I think Warren Buffett writes his annual report. He addresses it to his sisters, very intelligent women, but they don't work in finance. And he writes his report and then kind of crosses the name out. And Bob Levinson, one of the VW copywriters, said the same thing. So I probably don't apply it as they should. I try and write in a colloquial style that I think someone would find enjoyable, even if they didn't work in the industry. That's the aim. I'm not saying always achieve it. And I'm not sure I have a single person, but I often think about if one of my best friends, Chris, if he was reading, what would he think? But the person probably changes from session to session. So I agree with the principle, but I probably haven't applied it as methodically as Bob Levinson or Warren Buffett or you would recommend.
Has Chris read the book?
I don't know. Hopefully I'm going to see him on my 50th birthday, so I'll ask him. Maybe
so you give him a copy then. Yeah. Brilliant. All right. Thanks, Richard. And we'll be in touch soon. We'll put all the information in the show notes and we'll see you next time.
Thank you very much.
Cheers. Okay, that's it. And thanks for listening, everyone. And thank you to Richard for joining us. So many takeaways there, but the key things I'm leaving with are to make it easy, lower the cognitive load with concrete one-idea messaging, stand out by breaking category norms, and then stick with it by building in fluent devices and repeatable cues to build that salience. And remember, humor and rhyme boost recollection. So join us next time on The Audience Connection.